Now let's go over our question number 905, sort array by parity. Given an array A of non-negative integers, so we're going to be working with positives only, return an array consisting of all the even elements of A followed by all the odd elements of A. You may return any answer array that satisfies this condition. Okay, so what we want is we want a result that has evens first and then the odds. Now, if we were to look at our example, we have an array 3, 1, 2. So 2 is an odd, 4 is an even, right? And 2 is an even. We can have a result that looks like 2, 4, 3, 1, or we can have 4, 2, 3, 1. There can be many combinations as long as our evens come first and our odds come later. Now, at the top of my head, there's two ways to solve this problem. One is to create two arrays, odd and one for even, and add all the odds here, add all the evens here, and after you're done, just combine the two so that you have even and odd. Something else you can do is you can just keep one array. As you iterate through, you can add odd elements, and when you get an even, you can push it to the front using unshift, and keep using unshift for all the evens, and then just push in for odds. So that way you get all the evens in the front, odds at the end. If you guys find this helpful, make sure you guys like and subscribe. Thanks. Now let's implement our first solution. And for this one, what we're going to do is we're going to create two separate arrays, one for odd and one for even. And we're going to iterate through our array and put all the evens in the evens array and odds in the odds array. And finally, later, we're going to concatenate those two and get our result. Now, first, let's create our arrays. So first one is going to be odd, and next one is going to be even. Now, let's iterate through our array. So let I is equal to 0, I is going to be less than array.length, and we increment by 1 each time. Now, let's actually check if our current element is odd or even. So if A at index I, if this is divisible by 2, we want to add it to our evens array. So even.push, and we push in our current character. Otherwise, we're going to push it into our odd. So odd.push and push in our current character. And after you're done, we want to return our array, but we want to combine it first, and we want our evens to come first. So that's going to be return even.concatenate. So concat, and we pass in our odd. And you can see that we have our result 2, 4, 3, 1. So evens came first and odds came later. If you want, you can actually use the spread operator. That's okay too. So return, put in our array, use the spread operator for even, and then spread operator for our odd. Same as before, we have our evens first and odds later. Now let's go over our code. What we did was we created two separate arrays for odd and even. We iterated all the elements in our array. And if it's even, we add it to our evens array. And if it's odd, we add it to our odd array. And after we're done, we got our two arrays, right? An array with odd and an array with all the evens. And here we just combine the two arrays either using concat, or we can use the spread operator. But just remember that even has to come first because we want our evens first, and that's what the question asked, and we get our final result. Let's implement our second solution. And our second solution is going to have a time complexity of O of n squared and space of O of n. Now, we're going to actually use the unshift method and push method that we mentioned. So we're going to use unshift for evens to put it in the beginning of the array, and push for our odds to put it at the end of the array. Now let's create our array, and we're going to store our results here, and that's going to be output set it equal to an empty array, and then next we want to return our output. Let's do that first. Now we need to iterate through our array, and let's just use for each, use something different. So we give argument for current value. Now we have to check, well, if our current value is divisible by 2, that means that it's even. So if it's even, what do you want to do? We want to push it at the beginning of our output. So that's going to be output dot unshift, and we pass in our value else. So if it's odd, we want to push it in the end of our output. So that's going to be output dot push, and we pass in our current value. And as you can see, we have our result. So we have 4, 2, our evens, and our odds. Now let's just go over our code just really quickly. Now we created our result to sort our result, and we are iterating through our array. And we're not using a for loop here, just use something different for a while. And we're checking, same as before, if our current value is even, we want to put it in the beginning of our result array, and we use unshift for that. Otherwise, if it's odd, we want to add it to the end. And when we go through all the elements, we want to finally return our output, and we get our result over here. Now I want to try to implement another solution, another interesting solution. And for this one, we're going to use a sort function. So we're going to have a space complexity of O of 1, but time complexity is still going to be O of n squared. I thought this was going to be fun because I'm going to use something similar to implementing a quick sort. So I'm going to be iterating from two ends of my array and swap two numbers. So I'll explain more of that later, but let's first implement our swap function. Our swap function takes two indexes, I and j, and let's use the ES6 version. Element at index I and element at index j. This is going to be equal to element at index j and element at index I. So what this simply does is it just swaps two numbers. So let's say that our I was 0 and j is 3. Element at index 0 is 3 and element at index 3 is 4. If you were to swap those two, 4 would be at index 0 and 3 would be at index 3, right? So this way we're swapping elements, and we don't have to have an extra space for our array. We can just use in place method. Now I want to create two variables. Let I is equal to 0 and let j is equal to a.length minus 1. So the last index. So what we'll do is we're going to have two pointers, I and j. I starts from the beginning and j is going to start from the end. And we're going to be iterating through or moving through our list and check. Well, we know that if the element at the beginning of the array, that element is even, it's in the right place, right? And starting from the back, well, if the current element is odd, it's in the correct place, right? So we're going to move our pointers. For I, we're going to move it until we find an odd element. And for j, we're going to do that until we find an even element. And when we do find it, we're going to swap those two elements. So now let's try to implement that. And we are going to loop until I is less than or equal to j. And think about it, this makes sense, right? If the two indexes were to cross each other, so that means that we're going too far and there wouldn't be any point in swapping our elements, right? So we want to do it as long as I is less than or equal to j. And next, I want to create another while loop. And as long as my current element, starting from the beginning, if this is even, I want to increment my I pointer by 1 because, again, if our current element in the beginning is even, it's in the correct spot. So I want to move my I pointer until I find an odd element. And I want to do the same for my odd. So while a at index j is odd, what I want to do is I want to decrement index j by 1. So I is moving to the right and j is moving to the left. And later, if I is less than or equal to j, what I want to do is I want to swap those two numbers. So let's pass in our I and j. And another thing that you have to note is that we have to increment I by 1 and decrement j by 1 after we swap. And finally, we want to return our array, which is a. And you can see that our solution worked, right? Now let's go over our code. So first thing we did was we created a swap function to swap two numbers at a given index. Next, we created two pointers, I and j. I is going to start from the beginning, j is going to start from the end, and j is going to go towards the left, and I is going towards the right. And we need to iterate through our array now. Okay, so we're looping as long as I is less than or equal to j. So when they cross each other, we're going to stop because we're done swapping. And I is going to move to the right as long as the current element is even. So we want to find the first instance of odd because we're switching odd with even. And j is doing the opposite. So j is moving right to left looking for even numbers. So when it finds that odd or even number, it's going to keep that index, and I is going to do the same thing. When it finds that odd, it's going to keep that index. Now we check, well, is I less than or equal to j? If it is, we're going to swap those two numbers. And another key thing to note is that we have to increment our number, our I, by 1 and decrement j by 1 because we want to keep moving along our array. So in the first iteration, our I is going to be 3 and 4 and j is going to be at index 3. So index 0 and 3. And we hit our while loop. Well, is 0 less than or equal to 3? Well, it's true. So we go into our second while loop. Well, is the current element even? No, it's not, right? It's odd. So we keep 0. So we don't increment at all. So we keep 0 and we go down to this one. Well, is our element odd? No, it's not, right? So it doesn't decrement yet and we keep the last index. So index 3. So our I is 0 and j is 3 for now. And we check, well, is I less than or equal to j? It is, right? So we swapped those two numbers. So we swap 3 and 4 comes here and 3 comes here. Now we have to increment our I by 1 and decrement j by 1 because we want our pointer to point to element 1 and j to point to element 2. Now we check again, is I less than or equal to j? Well, it's true, right? Is this element even? Well, no, it's not. It's odd. So we don't actually hit this statement. And we check again. Well, is our current element even? Well, it is, right? So we don't actually decrement here because if you were to decrement, our j would point to here and you're swapping the same thing and we don't want that. And we check, is I less than or equal to j? It is, right? So we swap those two numbers and increment I by 1 and decrement j by 1. And we check again. Well, this time our I is going to be 2 and j is going to be 1. So this evaluates to false and finally we return our result. So this might be a little hard to understand, but I think if you know quicksort, it should be relatively easy. And if you want to know more about quicksort, I definitely recommend you to look into that because it should be really helpful. If you guys find this helpful, make sure you guys like and subscribe. Thanks.